Democracy is at a crossroads. Around the globe, leaders are testing its resilience, some claiming reform, while others work to erode its foundations. Political crises and growing polarization can make it feel like democracy is failing. But is this the reality? One common conception is that democratic backsliding is caused by a failure to deliver material resources that people need. But Thomas Carothers warns against oversimplifying the causes of democratic erosion.
When democratic backsliding started to become a dominant trend, which it did sometime in the late 2000s and then across the 2010s, it was really the driving force, I would say, in global politics. People began, of course, searching for explanations. Why is this happening? And one of the explanations that people gravitated towards fairly quickly was this idea that, it's a failure of democracy to deliver. And the thinking was the following, that if democracy fails to deliver, the citizens become alienated from it. Think, democracy is good for nothing. And they vote for anti-democratic figures who threaten to tear apart democracy to provide a better life for people. It's an attractive idea. It has a certain sort of common sense plausibility to it. And I think, maybe in Tunisia, for example, the self-coup by the president there several years ago, he was able to ride the wave of Tunisians' unhappiness about how democracy had not produced a better life for most Tunisians and have an initial wave of popularity. So I can see a case there. But then I would look at other cases. I'd look at Poland and I think, wait a minute. Poland entered, into a serious anti-democratic wave in the late 2010s, but Poland had been the best economy in Central Europe. So wait a minute. Poland was delivering as a democracy more for its citizens than any of its Central European peers, yet it was the one, together with Hungary, that was going backward the most. So that doesn't confirm our hypothesis there. Or I would look at Israel. And Israel began having serious trouble with, divisive polarization between the right and the non-right in Israel, and an anti-democratic trend coming from the right. It wasn't about a failure of Israeli democracy to deliver the economic goods to Israelis. The Israeli economy was a kind of a miracle economy of the last 20 years in many ways for many Israeli citizens, at least. And so it wasn't Israel's failure to deliver as a democracy that was leading to a right-wing, somewhat illiberal movement and what Netanyahu was doing to the judicial system and other things. It just doesn't seem as simple as it might appear. So I did this study together with a colleague, Brendan, and we looked at, rates of inequality, rates of economic growth, and other socioeconomic indicators, and just did not find a correlation or any sort of causal pattern. And that seemed to be other things going on. So what other things, you would naturally ask? And I came to the conclusion that really what's happening in the world is that many democracy came to many countries that have fairly weak traditions of democracy, relatively weak institutions. And in those systems, as competition for power has gone on, anti-democratic actors have emerged, fairly strong-minded players who think, I'd like a piece of this power. And then they run for office, often on a democratic ticket as reformers. Modi, ran for office as a reformer, saying, I'm going to fix Indian democracy. And they don't run on an anti-democratic ticket saying, I'm anti-democratic. They say, no, I'm going to strengthen. I'm going to get this back into shape. And voters say, it's time to send the system a signal. We're going to make this country great again. It sounds familiar. And so people are running on saying, I'm going to fix democracy. And what's happening is they get elected, and then in order to carry out their program, they start pushing against the barriers that on their power. And so they don't like the judicial system because it tells them they can't do this or that. And so they start to undermine the judiciary. They don't like the press because it's criticizing them. So they start to come down hard on the press. They don't like these pesky civil society groups that are inspecting their corruption and, using transparency as a tool to, show their wrongdoing. So they crack down on them. And so it's the expansion of power by elected leaders who are just determined to keep amassing power for power's sake. And it isn't that, they're all about this issue of delivering. It's about the difficulty of constraining power holders. That's democracy's central challenge, is how do you constrain power? And when it's, very settled in a country, like to go back to Finland, where the rule of law is very meaningful, then, you can constrain power through law and through other institutions. But in a lot of countries, power holders come in and say, Those judges weren't elected. I was. I'm going to do what I want. And we have an epidemic in the world of elected leaders who are simply very hard to contain and are very determined to keep amassing power. They're feeding off each other in many cases, picking up narratives from each other of fake news or other things like that. And so what's really happening is a demonstration of the weakness of constraints more than the failure of democracy to deliver socioeconomically.
2024 was a big year of elections around the world. Many analysts have reached conclusions about the broader health of democracy. But Carothers notes that this past year is not as decisive for democracy's future as some may think.
I'm afraid that I don't think this year is really decisive. In the first place, a lot of elections that are held are not that decisive for democracy in either good or bad cases. By good cases, I mean where democracy is fairly stable, like Finland, very stable actually. They have an election and, it tells you a bit about the fortunes of the parties in power or the parties in opposition. It doesn't tell you very much about the fortunes of Finnish democracy more generally. Or in negative cases like Russia, where elections are held, but they're a charade. Elections there this year didn't tell us very much about the fate of Russian politics. It was just, unfortunately, autocratic business as usual. So either democratic business as usual, autocratic business as usual, not much indication. Now, there were some cases that were a bit more telling. On the positive side, Senegal's a very nice example of a country that was in trouble last year. Macky Sall, the president, was taking some actions that really threw into question Senegal's fairly long-standing democratic transition, fear of delaying or even canceling elections. And instead, the elections were held thanks to intervention by the Constitutional Court. Elections were held. A pro-democratic reformist figure came in, and since then has been trying hard to put Senegalese democracy back on track. Or Botswana, for example, a country quite democratic, in a sense a democratic star in Africa, but had always been under the rule in its modern history by one party, a dominant power system. And this election, for the first time, brought alternation of power to Botswana, which is a really important sign of democratic progress for a country that shows some dangers of getting trapped in single-party rule over time.
The U.S. presidential election is a big part of this story, too. Many in the U.S. view Donald Trump's re-election as very bad news for democracy. Carothers outlines some of the red flags, or at least yellow flags, of America's current politics.
The arrival to power of Donald Trump in January will bring, I'd say, two dangers with it for global democracy. The first is that many of his political methods or political messaging are read in the world in very negative ways for democracy. When he rails about the fake news, for example, during his first term as president, he railed about fake news a lot, but he didn't really take many concrete actions to hurt the free press in the United States. But the problem is, what's more bark than bite in the United States? When you take that idea and take it to Belarus or take it to Sri Lanka or take it to wherever it might be, Brazil, and they say, oh, apparently this is what democracies do, or democratic leaders do, is they rail against independent press and they use the tools they have to constrain it. The bark becomes worse abroad. And so what happens is messages here that are maybe not as disturbing as they might be if you look carefully at what Donald Trump might be able to do if he acted on some of his statements, whether about the free press, whether about political retribution, and so forth. In other countries, those can play out in much more serious ways. Second danger, or a second yellow flag that's flapping, is unfortunately soon-to-be President Trump does have a predilection for some leaders in the world. He tends to favor certain leaders in the world who are not very democratic. Obviously, he mentioned Viktor Orban of Hungary in the presidential debate and said, when you look around the world, who likes me? Well, look at this leader. And he's a strong guy, as he said. And clearly, Viktor Orban's going to get a boost at home politically and say, hey, I've got the most powerful person in the world behind me. So, I might want to crack down a little harder on this person or this organization, and I know I'm going to get protection. Whether or not he really will, he may well believe that. And so leaders who see friendship with Donald Trump as emboldening them, protecting them, and who have an anti-democratic inclination or temperament or record, as some of these leaders do, we could see an escalation of anti-democratic actions, at least in a certain number of countries. Neither of these things will be sweeping global trends, But both of them, the messaging from the United States and the embrace of certain leaders, are troubling.
So what can we learn from the past year of democratic elections?
I think the lesson has to be we have to prize, we have to reinforce, we have to do everything we can to strengthen the institutions that constrain power in a pro-democratic way. We have to stand up for judiciaries when they're undercut. We have to stand up for independent media. We have to stand up for electoral commissions. We have to stand up for civil society when it's threatened. We have to stand up for political opposition figures who are being harassed or put in jail and so forth. If we don't defend the bulwarks of democracy with everything we have, then leaders who are determined to override them are going to win. And so it's a lesson of take what we know to be the core of a functioning democracy, these institutions, value them highly, and in the heat of the moment, whatever agenda one is pursuing, don't lose sight of these institutional safeguards. Don't lose sight of these underlying democratic norms and values. Because if we do, then everything is like the apps on your phone when you push the wrong button and they're all jiggling and you're afraid to touch it. That's the way democracy feels a bit that way in the world right now. So reinforce, don't start moving the pieces around too quickly.
Read more about what we can learn from 2024's year of elections in Tom Carothers' articles, 3 Conclusions from the Global Year of Elections, or his episode with the World Unpacked podcast.